Section 6 of Further Chronicles of Avonlea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Further Chronicles of Avonlea by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 3. Her Father's Daughter, Part 2. Suddenly she heard a step behind her. When she turned her head, a man was standing beside her, looking down at her with big, merry blue eyes. Rachel was quite sure that she had never seen him before, yet those eyes seemed to her to have a strangely familiar look. She liked him. She felt no shyness nor timidity, such as usually afflicted her in the presence of strangers. He was a tall, stout man, dressed in rough fishing suit, and wearing an oilskin cap on his head. His hair was very thick and curly and fair. His cheeks were tanned and red. His teeth, when he smiled, were very even and white. Rachel thought he must be quite old, because there was a good deal of gray mixed with his fair hair. "Are you watching for the mermaids?" he said. Rachel nodded gravely. From anyone else she would have scrupulously hidden such a thought. "Yes, I am," she said. "Mother says there is no such thing as a mermaid, but I like to think there is. Have you ever seen one?" The big man sat down on a bleached log of driftwood and smiled at her. "No, I'm sorry to say that I haven't. But I have seen many other very wonderful things. I might tell you about some of them if you would come over here and sit by me." Rachel went unhesitatingly. When she reached him, he pulled her down on his knee, and she liked it. "What a nice little craft you are," he said. "Do you suppose now that you could give me a kiss?" As a rule, Rachel hated kissing. She could seldom be prevailed upon to kiss even her uncles, who knew it and liked to tease her for kisses until they aggravated her so terribly that she told them she couldn't bear men. But now she promptly put her arms about this strange man's neck and gave him a hearty smack. "I like you," she said frankly. She felt his arms tighten suddenly about her. The blue eyes looking into hers grew misty and very tender. Then, all at once, Rachel knew who he was. He was her father. She did not say anything, but she laid her curly head down on his shoulder and felt a great happiness, as of one who had come into some longed-for haven. If David Spencer realized that she understood, he said nothing. Instead, he began to tell her fascinating stories of far lands he had visited and strange things he had seen. Rachel listened entranced, as if she were hearkening to a fairy tale. Yes, he was just as she had dreamed him. She had always been sure he could tell beautiful stories. "Come up to the house and I'll show you some very pretty things," he said finally. Then followed a wonderful hour. The little low-ceilinged room, with its square window, into which he took her, was filled with the flotsam and jetsam of his roving life, things beautiful and odd and strange beyond all telling. The things that pleased Rachel most were two huge shells on the chimney-piece, pale pink shells with big crimson and purple spots. "Oh, I didn't know there could be such pretty things in the world!" she exclaimed. "If you would like," began the big man. Then he paused for a moment. "I'll show you something prettier still." Rachel felt vaguely that he meant to say something else when he began, but she forgot to wonder what it was when she saw what he brought out of a little corner cupboard. It was a teapot of some fine, glistening purpleware, coiled over by golden dragons with gilded claws and scales. The lid looked like a beautiful golden flower, and the handle was a coil of a dragon's tail. Rachel sat and looked at it, rapt-eyed. "That's the only thing of any value I have in the world, now," he said. Rachel knew there was something very sad in his eyes and voice. She longed to kiss him again and comfort him. But suddenly he began to laugh, and then he rummaged out some goodies for her to eat, sweetmeats more delicious than she had ever imagined. While she nibbled them, he took down an old violin and played music that made her want to dance and sing. Rachel was perfectly happy. She wished she might stay forever in that low, dim room with all its treasures. "I see your little friends coming around the point," he said finally. "I suppose you must go. Put the rest of the goodies in your pocket." He took her up in his arms and held her tightly against his breast for a single moment. She felt him kissing her hair. "There, run along, little girl. Good-bye." he said gently. "Why don't you ask me to come and see you again?" cried Rachel, half in tears. "I'm coming anyhow." "If you can come, come," he said. "If you don't come, I shall know it is because you can't, and that is much to know. I'm very, very, very glad, little woman, that you have come once." Rachel was sitting demurely on the skids when her companions came back. They had not seen her leaving the house, and she said not a word to them of her experiences. She only smiled mysteriously when they asked her if she had not been lonesome. That night, for the first time, she mentioned her father's name in her prayers. She never forgot to do so afterwards. She always said, "Bless Mother and Father," with an instinctive pause between the two names, a pause which indicated new realization of the tragedy which had sundered them. And the tone in which she said "Father" was softer and more tender than the one which voiced "Mother." Rachel never visited the cove again. Isabella Spencer discovered that the children had been there, and although she knew nothing of Rachel's interview with her father, she told the child that she must never again go to that part of the shore. Rachel shed many a bitter tear in secret over this command, but she obeyed it. Thenceforth there had been no communication between her and her father, save the unworded messages of soul to soul across whatever may divide them. David Spencer's invitation to his daughter's wedding was sent with the others, and the remaining days of Rachel's maidenhood slipped away in a whirl of preparation and excitement in which her mother revelled, but which was distasteful to the girl. The wedding day came at last, breaking softly and fairly over the great sea in a sheen of silver and pearl and rose, a September day as mild and beautiful as June. The ceremony was to be performed at 8 o'clock in the evening. At 7 Rachel stood in her room, fully dressed and alone. She had no bridesmaid, and she had asked her cousins to leave her to herself in this last solemn hour of girlhood. She looked very fair and sweet in the sunset light that showered through the birches. Her wedding gown was a fine, sheer organdie, simply and daintily made. In the loose waves of her bright hair she wore her bridegroom's flowers, roses as white as a virgin stream. She was very happy, but her happiness was faintly threaded with a sorrow inseparable from all change. Presently her mother came in, carrying a small basket. "Here is something for you, Rachel. One of the boys from the harbor brought it up. He was bound to give it into your own hands, said that was his orders. I just took it and sent him to the right about, told him I'd give it to you at once, and that was all that was necessary." She spoke coldly. She knew quite well who had sent the basket, and she resented it, but her resentment was not quite strong enough to overcome her curiosity. She stood silently by while Rachel unpacked the basket. Rachel's hands trembled as she took off the cover. 2 huge, pink-spotted shells came first. How well she remembered them! Beneath them, carefully wrapped up in a square of foreign-looking, strangely scented silk, was the dragon teapot. She held it in her hands and gazed at it with tears gathering thickly in her eyes. "Your father sent that," said Isabella Spencer with an odd sound in her voice. "I remember it well. It was among the things I packed up and sent after him. His father had brought it home from China 50 years ago, and he prized it beyond anything. They used to say it was worth a lot of money." "Mother, please leave me alone for a little while," said Rachel, imploringly. She had caught sight of a little note at the bottom of the basket, and she felt that she could not read it under her mother's eyes. Mrs. Spencer went out with unaccustomed acquiescence, and Rachel went quickly to the window, where she read her letter by the fading gleams of twilight. It was very brief, and the writing was that of a man who holds a pen but seldom. "My dear little girl," it ran, "I'm sorry I can't go to your wedding. It was like you to ask me, for I know it was your doing. I wish I could see you married, but I can't go to the house I was turned out of. I hope you will be very happy. I am sending you the shells and teapot you liked so much. Do you remember that day we had such a good time? I would like to have seen you again before you were married, but it can't be. Your loving father, David Spencer." Rachel resolutely blinked away the tears that filled her eyes. A fierce desire for her father sprang up in her heart, an insistent hunger that would not be denied. She must see her father. She must have his blessing on her new life. A sudden determination took possession of her whole being, a determination to sweep aside all conventionalities and objections as if they had not been. It was now almost dark. The guests would not be coming for half an hour yet. It was only 15 minutes' walk over the hill to the cove. Hastily Rachel shrouded herself in her new raincoat and drew a dark, protecting hood over her gay head. She opened the door and slipped noiselessly downstairs. Mrs. Spencer and her assistants were all busy in the back part of the house. In a moment Rachel was out in the dewy garden. She would go straight over the fields. Nobody would see her. It was quite dark when she reached the cove. In the crystal cup of the sky over her the stars were blinking. Flying flakes of foam were scurrying over the sand like elfin things. A soft little wind was crooning about the eaves of the little gray house where David Spencer was sitting, alone in the twilight, his violin on his knee. He had been trying to play, but could not. His heart yearned after his daughter, yes, and after a long estranged bride of his youth. His love of the sea was sated forever. His love for wife and child still cried for its own under all his old anger and stubbornness. The door opened suddenly, and the very Rachel of whom he was dreaming came suddenly in, flinging off her wraps and standing forth in her young beauty and bridal adornments, a splendid creature, almost lighting up the gloom with her radiance. "Father!" she cried brokenly, and her father's eager arms closed around her. Back in the house she had left, the guests were coming to the wedding. There were jests and laughter and friendly greeting. The bridegroom came too, a slim, dark-eyed lad who tiptoed bashfully upstairs to the spare room, from which he presently emerged to confront Mrs. Spencer on the landing. "I want to see Rachel before we go down," he said, blushing. Mrs. Spencer deposited a wedding present of linen on the table which was already laden with gifts, opening the door of Rachel's room, and called her. There was no reply. The room was dark and still. In sudden alarm, Isabella Spencer snatched the lamp from the hall table and held it up. The little white room was empty. No blushing, white-clad bride tenanted it. But David Spencer's letter was lying on the stand. She caught it up and read it. "Rachel is gone!" she gasped. A flash of intuition had revealed to her where and why the girl had gone. "Gone?" echoed Frank, his face blanching. His pallid dismay recalled Mrs. Spencer to herself. She gave a bitter, ugly little laugh. "Oh, you needn't look so scared, Frank. She hasn't run away from you. Hush, come in here, shut the door. Nobody must know of this. Nice gossip it would make. That little fool has gone to the cove to see her father. I know she has. It's just like what she would do. He sent her those presents. Look, and this letter. Read it. She has gone to coax him to come and see her married. She was crazy about it. And the minister is here, and it is 7:30. She'll ruin her dress and shoes in the dust and dew. And what if someone has seen her? Was there ever such a little fool?" Frank's presence of mind had returned to him. He knew all about Rachel and her father. She had told him everything. "I'll go after her," he said gently. "Get me my hat and coat. I'll slip down the back stairs and over to the cove." "You must get out of the pantry window, then," said Mrs. Spencer firmly, mingling comedy and tragedy after her characteristic fashion. "The kitchen is full of women. I won't have this known and talked about, if it can possibly be helped." The bridegroom, wise beyond his years in the knowledge that it was well to yield to women in little things, crawled obediently out of the pantry window and darted through the birchwood. Mrs. Spencer had stood quakingly on guard until he had disappeared. So Rachel had gone to her father. Like had broken the fetters of years and fled to like. "It isn't much use fighting against nature, I guess," she thought, grimly. "I'm beat. He must have thought something of her after all when he sent her that teapot and letter. And what does he mean about the day they had such a good time? Well, it just means she's been to see him before, sometime, I suppose, and kept me in ignorance of it all." Mrs. Spencer shut down the pantry window with a vicious thud. "If only she'll come quietly back with Frank in time to prevent gossip, I'll forgive her," she said as she turned to the kitchen. Rachel was sitting on her father's knee, with both her white arms around his neck when Frank came in. She sprang up, her face flushed and appealing, her eyes bright and dewy with tears. Frank thought he had never seen her look so lovely. "Oh, Frank, is it very late? Oh, are you angry?" she exclaimed timidly. "No, no, dear, of course I'm not angry. But don't you think you'd better come back now? It's nearly 8, and everybody is waiting." "I've been trying to coax Father to come up and see me married," said Rachel. "Help me, Frank." "You'd better come, sir," said Frank heartily. "I'd like it as much as Rachel would." David Spencer shook his head stubbornly. "No, I can't go to that house. I was locked out of it. Never mind me. I've had my happiness in this half hour with my little girl. I'd like to see her married, but it isn't to be." "Yes, it is to be. It shall be," said Rachel resolutely. "You shall see me married. Frank, I'm going to be married here in my father's house. That is the right place for a girl to be married. Go back and tell the guests so, and bring them all down." Frank looked rather dismayed. David Spencer said deprecatingly, "Little girl, don't you think it would be—" "I'm going to have my own way in this," said Rachel with a sort of tender finality. "Go, Frank. I'll obey you all my life after, but you must do this for me. Try to understand," she added beseechingly. "Oh, I understand," Frank reassured her. "Besides, I think you are right. But I was thinking of your mother. She won't come." "Then you tell her that if she doesn't come I shan't be married at all," said Rachel. She was betraying unsuspected ability to manage people. She knew that ultimatum would urge Frank to his best endeavors. Frank, much to Mrs. Spencer's dismay, marched boldly in at the front door upon his return. She pounced on him and whisked him out of sight into the supper room. "Where's Rachel? What made you come that way? Everybody saw you." "It makes no difference. They will all have to know anyway. Rachel says she is going to be married from her father's house, or not at all. I've come back to tell you so." Isabella's face turned crimson. "Rachel has gone crazy. I wash my hands of this affair. Do as you please. Take the guests, the supper too, if you can carry it." "We'll all come back here for supper," said Frank, ignoring the sarcasm. "Come, Mrs. Spencer, let's make the best of it." "Do you suppose that I am going to David Spencer's house?" said Isabella Spencer violently. "Oh, you must come, Mrs. Spencer," cried poor Frank desperately. He began to fear that he would lose his bride past all finding in this maze of triple stubbornness. "Rachel says she won't be married at all if you don't go too. Think what a talk it will make. You know she will keep her word." Isabella Spencer knew it. Amid all the conflict of anger and revolt in her soul was a strong desire not to make a worse scandal than must of necessity be made. The desire subdued and tamed her as nothing else could have done. "I will go since I have to," she said icily. "What can't be cured must be endured. Go and tell them." 5 minutes later the 60 wedding guests were all walking over the fields to the cove, with the minister and the bridegroom in the front of the procession. They were too amazed even to talk about the strange happening. Isabella Spencer walked behind, fiercely alone. They all crowded into the little room of the house at the cove, and a solemn hush fell over it, broken only by the purr of the sea wind around it and the croon of the waves on the shore. David Spencer gave his daughter away, but when the ceremony was concluded, Isabella was the first to take the girl in her arms. She clasped her and kissed her, with tears streaming down her pale face, all her nature melted in a mother's tenderness. "Rachel, Rachel, my child, I hope and pray that you may be happy," she said brokenly. In the surge of the sudden merry crowd of well-wishers around the bride and groom, Isabella was pushed back into a shadowy corner behind a heap of sails and ropes. Looking up, she found herself crushed against David Spencer. For the first time in 20 years the eyes of husband and wife met. A strange thrill shot to Isabella's heart. She felt herself trembling. "Isabella," it was David's voice in her ear, a voice full of tenderness and pleading, the voice of the young wooer of her girlhood. "Is it too late to ask you to forgive me? I've been a stubborn fool, but there hasn't been an hour in all these years that I haven't thought about you and our baby and longed for you." Isabella Spencer had hated this man, yet her hate had been but a parasite growth on a nobler stem, with no abiding roots of his own. It withered under his words, and lo, there was the old love, fair and strong and beautiful as ever. "Oh, David, I was all to blame," she murmured brokenly. Further words were lost on her husband's lips. When the hubbub of handshaking and congratulating had subsided, Isabella Spencer stepped out before the company. She looked almost girlish and bridal herself, with her flushed cheeks and bright eyes. "Let's go back now and have supper and be sensible," she said crisply. "Rachel, your father is coming too. He is coming to stay," with a defiant glance around the circle. "Come, everybody." They went back with laughter and raillery over the quiet autumn fields, faintly silvered now by the moon that was rising over the hills. The young bride and groom lagged behind. They were very happy, but they were not so happy, after all, as the old bride and groom who walked swiftly in front. Isabella's hand was in her husband's, and sometimes she could not see the moonlit hills for a mist of glorified tears. "David," she whispered, as he helped her over the fence, "how can you ever forgive me?" "There's nothing to forgive," he said. "We're only just married. Who ever heard of a bridegroom talking of forgiveness? Everything is beginning over new for us, my girl." End of section 6.